You are listening to part 67 of our series, 7 Medicines, The Wise Woman Way, with Susan Wade at Time Monk Radio. Hello, Susan, and welcome back to Time Monk Radio.
Thank you, Gemini. I am so happy to be able to offer us all lots of herbal antihistamines and even a fair list of natural antihistamines as well. Oregano, osha, plantain, ephedra, jewelweed, tea, nettle, anise, fennel, caraway, butterbur, ginger, parsley, fennel, reishi, echinacea, basil, lemon balm, thyme, papaya, chamomile, ragweed, saffron, cloves, eyebright, elder, burdock, and linden. Oh my goodness, what a huge group of herbal antihistamines we have to choose from. So where should we start? Let's start with ephedra. Last week we were talking about EpiPens. We talked about how if the histamine response, instead of just localizing the venom or the sting or the pollen, goes haywire, then the body shuts down and we can't get any oxygen and we die. And that people who can get an anaphylactic shock reaction carry an EpiPen with them, which contains epinephrine. And remember that compounds are named after the plants they're first found in, and so epinephrine comes from ephedra. Neoepinephrine, epinephrine, these are compounds that were first found in ephedra, especially ephedra sinica, which has been used in China for thousands of years to counter histamine reactions. Ephedra contains ephedrine and pseudoephedrine. They are both stimulating and thermogenic, which means they make things go faster and they make things go hotter. These alkaloids stimulate the brain, increase the heart rate, constrict blood vessels, increase blood pressure, expand bronchial tubes. In fact, it has just the opposite effect from histamine, which gives us a dull brain that can't think clearly, which opens up the blood vessels, dropping blood pressure, and closes down the bronchial tubes, making breathing much more difficult. So we can see how it is that ephedra has got to lead the list of herbal antihistamines. It is indeed, in its drug form, a lifesaver. Now, of course, there can be some small problems. Ephedra was pushed very heavily as a way to lose weight because of that thermogenic reaction, the making you hot reaction. And there was all this stuff that, it's going to speed up your metabolism and make you lose weight. And college students were taking ephedra in capsule form, sometimes with other drugs mixed in with them. And there were some heart problems. I think there were even some deaths. And so what happened was ephedra got on the no-no list. And it's not easy to get ephedra. It's also called Mormon tea. So you live out in Utah. I have a friend who lives in Utah. You can get some Mormon tea. It's a weed out there. Good to have on hand, not as fast as an EpiPen, which you just jab into you and works immediately, since you have to brew up the ephedra into a tea and drink it. There are some adverse effects from taking ephedra, and they vary from person to person. Most of them are pretty mild, but the side effects of taking ephedra increase as the dose increases and as the form of use changes. And this is in general true for all the classes of things that we are looking at. The antihistamines, the decongestants, the steroids, and even herbal antihistamines are least likely to cause side effects if they can be put directly where the reaction is happening. In other words, a skin cream, something that we can drop in our eyes. These have the fewest side effects. Things that we are spraying up our nose have greater side effects, and once we're taking them in our mouths, they have greater side effects. The least of those greater side effects being if we actually take it in a way that we can taste it, and the greatest of them being if it's somehow put into a capsule or a tablet and taken where we can't actually taste it. And as I said, that's exactly what was going on with Ephedra. And we got skin reactions, irritability, dizziness, trembling, headaches, profuse perspiration, itchy scalp, vomiting, hyperthermia, in other words, getting too hot, irregular heartbeat, seizure, heart attack, stroke. Whew. And there's some problems with Ephedra. So, let's talk all at once about two great antihistamine herbs, jewelweed and nettle. You're right, we can't do it at once. All right, let's talk about jewelweed first. Impatience, especially impatiens pallida. Jewelweed is a pretty common wild plant of the northeast part of the United States. Different varieties of it. The pallida, which has a yellow flower, can grow quite tall. I have a pallida variety by my kitchen garden, and it usually gets taller than me, 6, 7, sometimes even 8 feet. There's an orange-flowered variety that's much smaller. You always find jewelweed growing with its feet wet. It's an annual plant. It doesn't have very much root, and the root is kind of fleshy. And we want to harvest it by the roots. Very easily done, since it's growing in wet places, to pull up the jewelweed, of course not decimating any area. And then I take that jewelweed, put it into a pan, press down, cover it with cold water, bring it to a boil, and cook it until it turns orange. Last year, when we were on the Green Witch holiday, a wonderful 4-day event here at the Wise Women Center, we went, as we always do, up to Herb Hill with Gretchen. And Gretchen was boiling jewelweed with witch hazel. She bought regular witch hazel extract at the pharmacy and was boiling the jewelweed. Same thing, the whole jewelweed fresh in a pan, push down, cover with the witch hazel, and boil until it turns bright orange, and then she let it cool and poured it back in the witch hazel bottles. What are we doing with this stuff? We are using jewelweed to absolutely, really, really quickly act as a natural antihistamine against rashes, poison ivy, poison oak, heat rash, ringworm, black fly bites, mosquito bites. If your skin is freaking out and it's inflamed and it's swollen and histamine is going to town there, jewelweed is going to act as a natural antihistamine. Now, you might say, hey, I heard about using jewelweed against poison ivy. You just take it and crush it and put it on the skin. It has a somewhat mild effect there, but when you cook it up, it has a powerful, powerful effect. And yes, it can be taken internally as well to relieve a variety of joint problems, whether it's from arthritis or an injury. Jewelweed taken internally is fabulous to relieve that. Now, this was one of those serendipitous things. You know, I'm very interested in wild foods. And I had a wild food cookbook, and it said, make a beautiful broth of jewelweed. It makes this beautiful orange broth. And then you can take some pretty colored flowers and float it in and serve it. So I thought that's a great idea. There's lots of jewelweed. And I do tend to use the orange flowered ones because we want that orange. The orange compound is really important in there. And so I did. I picked some jewelweed. I covered it in cold water. I brought it to boil. I strained it out, made some beautiful jewelweed broth, and served it to some students at lunch one day because we like to eat wild foods at lunch here at the Wise Women Center. And one of them called me a few days later and said, that was the most remarkable thing for getting rid of my joint pain. I want to know how you did that. And I've been using it ever since. That's over 30 years now. Not just rubbed on the skin, but brewed up, as we're talking about, into a broth as one of my favorite herbal antihistamines. stinging nettle. Ah, yes, I love stinging nettle. And that's why I said you could go third stinging nettle, because we had a solid and great relationship. About 58% of participants found their hay fever and other allergic symptoms relieved with the use of nettles, and 69% of those rated it as far better than a placebo. So this was not where people are divided into groups and kept in those groups, but where people are divided into those groups and then switched. So it's a slightly different kind of study. Often, like one of the studies I'm participating in now, people, I'm supposedly taking vitamin D and or fish oil. And a quarter of the people are taking vitamin D and fish oil. A quarter of the people aren't taking either. A quarter of the people are taking fish oil but not vitamin D, and a quarter are taking vitamin D but not fish oil. So there's no actual placebo in our study. In this study, people took nettle for a certain amount of time and kept a symptom journey, and then were switched to the placebo, only they didn't know. So they might have started taking the placebo and then been given the nettle, or they might have started taking the nettle and then been given the placebo. So they were actually able to compare the two different things. They were told that it was two different herbs, although one of them was not an herb at all. Have you ever heard of a nettle being used to relieve allergy symptoms?
I have.
Do you have any experience with that, or any friends of yours?
Well, we take stinging nettle in the form of infusion, and I don't think our hay fever is as bad here in Tennessee.
That is something that I have heard from hundreds and hundreds of people, Jim and I.
I'm not surprised by that.
Yeah. What's of course pushed is freeze-dried nettle, and you take it like an antihistamine. You wait until you have a problem, and then you take the freeze-dried nettle, and you wait for it to have an effect. And, I understand, because we're in a drug mentality. It's pretty easy to think, okay, well, this herb is going to replace this drug, and I'll put it in a capsule and take it just like the drug. But if we can really rethink that and say, hey, there's something going on with the stinging nettle, and if I start drinking that, is it going to have an effect? And one of the things that's going on is that overabundant reaction to histamine is mediated by adrenaline. And, of course, nettle strengthens the adrenal glands, so we don't make so much cortisone, which is a hormone of stress. So I agree with you and all those other people who say, yeah, you can take freeze-dried stinging nettle and that'll work, but drink your nettle infusion, not right at the time you're having the symptoms, but day by day, week by week. You don't have to drink it every single day. And over a period of a year or two, I would say far more than 75% of people find they have little or no allergic responses to pollen. I have also heard people say that it has helped them clear their dander reactions as well. Hooray for stinging nettle. I could have put OSHA at the very, very top of the list, even before Ephedra. And it's one of those times where it's just so hard to know what to talk to you about first. The Ephedra, we were talking about the EpiPen, and I think of OSHA tincture as being a kind of EpiPen. We have mentioned OSHA at various times here on our shows at Time Monk Radio, but when we're talking about herbal antihistamines, OSHA is perhaps the closest we have to something that works immediately to stop histamine reactions. And I myself have used it to help others who were definitely in anaphylactic shock. not breathing, lips turning blue, and putting OSHA tincture in those people's mouths has stopped their anaphylactic shock reaction literally in seconds. None of us want to be going into anaphylactic shock, and none of us want to have that kind of histamine reaction, but some people do. If you carry an EpiPen, what I say is carry a small bottle of OSHA tincture too. Take the OSHA tincture. It acts so fast that you'll know whether you need that EpiPen or not. You're not going to lose consciousness. OSHA is Ligusticum porteri, and it is a somewhat rare plant, and it's one of the reasons that I don't like to put it at the top of the list, because I don't want everybody running out and buying OSHA just in case. What I would like to see us do is, if we buy an entire 1 ounce bottle of OSHA, to get some half-ounce bottles and divide that up into 3 half-ounce bottles. I know you won't fill them up. And share with your friends, because except in the case of somebody actually going into anaphylactic shock, I use OSHA in tiny, tiny doses, 2 and 3 drop doses. I was teaching in Australia, and I got some goodness only knows what reaction to pollen in the air, a cold. I don't know what was going on, but I know what my symptoms were, and my symptoms were that I had a very sore throat, and that I had a runny nose, and that my eyes were really itchy. I took some echinacea to deal with the possibility of infection, but I also took some OSHA. And I especially would take 3 or 4 drops of OSHA before I would have to teach. I also mainlined honey. I kept a jar of honey right next to me. And I was really, every time I felt my throat and my lungs starting to go, I would just pick up that honey jar and take a swig of honey. So OSHA is not preventative. It's an emergency medicine that's used right at the time. I remember with great fondness my Aunt Rose at my parents' 50th wedding anniversary coming to me with a very typical runny nose, runny eyes, red eyes, sneezing, and saying I didn't think I would have reactions to the pollens here in California, and so I didn't bring my allergy medication. I gave her 3 drops of OSHA tincture in a small amount of water. She looked very skeptical, rather dubious. Oh, my goodness, what is this, crazy woman thinking that a couple of drops of something from a bottle is going to have an effect? But within 5 minutes, she was back in my room demanding to know what I had given her, saying that it worked faster and better than any allergy medicine she had ever taken. The effect of OSHA when we're taking it to relieve a sore throat, a cold, an allergy is short-lived, 3 to 4 hours, and she wanted more. And I said, I don't find it works really well to be taken really consistently. I prefer not to take more than a few doses in a day. So if you really need some OSHA, get some, share it with some friends. Other than that, let's leave a rare plant protected. A plant that is not rare at all is ragweed. Ambrosia artemisifolia, Ambrosia ambrosiodis, the small and the large ragweeds. Ragweeds bloom with tiny green flowers that you just never notice, but they bloom right at the same time as goldenrod, which has those beautiful racemes of bright golden flowers that you do notice. Poor goldenrod. Goldenrod gets blamed for the damage that ragweed pollen is doing. Now, here's the interesting thing that's going on. And we talked about this very first week of this month when we were talking about histamine and antihistamines. And that is that plants, flowering plants that are pollinated by the wind must make large amounts of pollen that has to be stickier and spikier. Plants that are insect pollinated, and I'm using insect here to stand in for bird and bat and butterfly and bee and all kinds of things, even slugs on occasion. Those plants don't need to make very much pollen because it's not being spread about by the wind and falling who knows where. They make nectar in little amounts of pollen, which is carried by the pollinator to the next flower. So honeybees only go to flowers that produce nectar, and the honey is made from the nectar, and those are the flowers which cannot and do not ever cause allergic reactions. So the idea that using honey would be a way to help prevent pollen allergies by giving yourself those pollens doesn't work, because those pollens aren't in the honey. I don't care if it's raw honey. I don't care if it's local honey. I don't care if it's honey from your own bees in your own garden. The pollens that you are going to have allergic reactions to are not in that honey. Even if you go and buy bee pollen, the pollens you're going to react to aren't in that honey. But you can do what people are trying to do with the honey by making a tincture of ragweed flowers. Now, you don't have to pick the little individual flowers. They are really small. You can pick the whole flowering top of the ragweed, chop it up, fill a jar full of the ragweed, pour 100 proof vodka over it, put a lid on it, put a label on it, let it sit around. By the time it's ready, 6 weeks, you're not going to be reacting to the ragweed anymore. Even with that extra 4 weeks of bloom time, it's going to be gone by the time the 6 weeks is up. But next year, as soon as you start to get any hay fever symptoms, you're going to pick up your jar of ragweed tincture, and you're going to take yourself, I like to start out with a small dose. Take 5 drops and see. If it doesn't do anything, take 5 more. If it doesn't do anything, take 5 more, and keep taking 5 more every 5 minutes until you get the relief from your symptoms that you want. I was pretty amazed when people first started telling me that their favorite way to deal with pollen allergies was to take ragweed tincture. It's a kind of homeopathic thought, isn't it? That the thing that gives the worst hay fever symptoms, ragweed, we're just going to take by the scruff of the neck and tincture it up and take it ourselves. Well, as I said, that's the idea in using bee pollen or in using honey, but it doesn't really work that way. Reishi Ganoderma lucidum, or Lingzhi, has been found to contain a compound that controls the chemicals in the body that help the release of histamine. So Lanistan works against these chemicals, and that inhibits the release of histamine. Remember, we were talking about cromolyn, and that it works in a very similar way. Reishi also strengthens the adrenal function, and that helps reduce the body's reaction to all allergens. Reishi is a mushroom, but it's not the kind of mushroom you're going to put in your pasta sauce. It's a really hard mushroom. And this is one time where it might be easier just to take the reishi or the reishi mycelium in a capsule or a tablet form. It certainly will have a pretty strong effect if you do it that way. Reishi mushrooms are used, especially in Japan, as one of the most promising natural antihistamines. I was very surprised to find that echinacea is also considered a natural antihistamine. I'm so focused on its ability to counter infection, but I have indeed seen echinacea relieve symptoms that go along with colds and flus that certainly come from histamine reactions. Jean Rose, a wonderful herbalist and one of the oldest of my herbal peers, has had asthma and breathing problems. And I remember her taking me aside one day, and she said, Susan, someday tea is going to be recognized as an herb. And I wasn't quite sure what she was saying. It was certainly clear to me that tea is an herb, but now that we're in a situation in which people really do recognize that tea is not just something to drink, that it's actually an herbal medicine, I begin to understand what she was getting at. And she said to me that she had found nothing better or easier to help deal with her asthma than black tea. And if she felt an asthma attack coming on, she could simply go into a restaurant, order a cup of hot black tea, get 2 tea bags, make it really strong, drink it, and then it worked as an incredible natural antihistamine and preventer of asthma attacks for her. Green tea, black tea, cheap tea, expensive tea, it's all real good. Papaya, for those of us in the tropics, can be applied topically or taken internally, and it inhibits the release of the histamine pretty well for a great number of people. So does ginger. But when we get to ginger now, we are starting to look at things that are used topically. So before we go to that, I would like to share with you the idea that taking herbs as antihistamines is certainly going to help not have the many side effects that histamines do. But if we just use them like antihistamines, then we're not going to get what we were talking about with the nettle, which is that really deeper strengthening that helps us move beyond the allergies, not just treating the symptoms of the allergies. But nonetheless, we do want to treat those symptoms. And things that we put on the outside of our skin, like ginger, can be very effective. Ginger is studied, of course, tremendously. Slice up a ginger root, simmer it in a couple of quarts of water for 30 minutes, turn off the fire and let it steep for another 30, and then soak hives, wheals, skin rashes, huge amounts of mosquito bites, black fly bites, whatever is causing that histamine reaction on your skin. Soak a cloth in the liquid and apply it to a large area, or just spray the ginger tea right on the skin. Parsley can also be crushed up and put right on the skin to stop hives, or it can be taken. Tests have shown that it has a pretty strong antihistamine reaction against hay fever symptoms. What I wouldn't suggest is juicing the parsley. There's compounds in the parsley that are pretty harsh on your kidneys. So you can make parsley tea. Yes, again, parsley is an herb. It is sold, and you can just make some parsley tea and drink it down. And parsley is related to those other wonderful aromatic herbs. Fennel, which is an excellent source of quercetin, and we're going to be talking about quercetin next week. And, of course, its wonderful, wonderful sisters, anise and caraway seed. Cardamom is usually put in with the aromatic seeds, and they're all great at treating allergic reactions. But parsley, fennel, anise, and caraway are all in a family and have very, very similar results. Butterbur, Pedicites hybridus, is an herb that is gaining great favor as an antihistamine, and European researchers say that it probably works better than drug antihistamines. Well, once again, we have had a marvelous time talking our time away. Green blessings really are everywhere. And I'll have to come back next week to finish up with a few more of these herbs and to talk about some other natural antihistamines.
Thank you so much, Susan. And this concludes part 67 of our series, The Seven Medicines, The Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio.